Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. Today I have with me Arjun Gargeyas, my colleague and researcher at the Takshashila Institution. Arjun works in the High-Tech Geopolitics program at Takshashila. Welcome, Arjun.
Hey Shri, very nice to be here. I think this is our first podcast together, so nice to be here.
Yes, I'm very excited, and I'm also more excited about the topic of discussion today. So, for our listeners, let me just briefly give an introduction. So, when we think of soft power, we usually think of arts, culture, diaspora, education, or health. However, in today's times, there is another aspect of soft power, which is technology and the relations which are born out of technology. Now, for any state in today's day and age, technology is a vital tool to push their influence in foreign countries and seek strategic gains. So, in fact, this kind of diplomacy has a new name now. It is called Techplomacy, born out of a marriage between technology and diplomacy. And guess what? No surprises here. China seems to be doing a lot of diplomacy these days. In fact, China's diplomacy has been cited as an example of how a state can achieve both technological growth while expanding its sphere of influence simultaneously. So let's begin today's discussion and jump right into diplomacy and its different dimensions. So, Arjun, why don't you begin by telling all of us how has China managed to use technology as a soft power tool to establish diplomatic relations?
Hey, yeah, so I think that was a really good introduction. But it's just the fact that technology has now become a tool in foreign policy itself. And we have seen that from in multiple instances in recent times, wherein technology plays such a major role in these bilateral and multilateral engagements between different states. And it's also used as both an offensive and defensive tool. We saw that with Russia invaded Ukraine. There were a whole bunch of sanctions which were put on Russia by the West, and this was very specific to certain kinds of technology itself. There were export restrictions which were put on the export of semiconductor chips. Just gives us an impression that technology now is not just, a driver for a state's economic growth, but it's also a driver for projecting the state's power and increasing its sphere of influence. And as you said, China has been doing that like in recent times. And the fact that it is seen that one of the main arguments for states to indulge in this kind of diplomacy is the rapid rise of China as a technological power itself. So the last 2 decades, I think the Chinese state has grown tremendously and has leapfrogged many technologically advanced states in critical technology domains. The fact that there is immense state support, and also there have been a rise of technology giants, Alibaba, Tencent, and even Huawei. This has given China a major tool to compete with other technological powers such as the US and certain European countries on the global level. That is when China realized that once it has reached that point where it can compete with the West in certain cases, especially in certain fields of technology, it can also promote and export its technology itself beyond the borders of the Chinese state, and hence increases sphere of influence. So this expansion of this so-called technology-oriented Sinosphere has made other states take kind of cognizance and also try to increase their diplomatic outreach just to counter China's growth. That's basically the background to it. But in terms of specifically how China has gone about it, you can divide it into, I think, two or three major parts. So one is consumer tech itself. Now, consumer tech, it involves telecommunications and all that technologies which provided to the average citizen of the country itself. So in terms of consumer tech, China has gone on and built this whole concept of building consumer tech infrastructure in other countries. So I'm pretty sure people would have heard of the Digital Silk Roads project. The Digital Silk Roads project was initiated by China to be an extended version to the BRI itself and focus on technology infrastructure. So, one of the main things that the Chinese did in terms of this Digital Silk Road projects is to build this kind of tech infrastructure and export this kind of tech infrastructure through their foreign policy project itself. So they integrated technology into key foreign policy projects, and especially the Belt and Road Initiative, which kind of includes state across the Indo-Pacific region all the way to the continent of Africa, has been touted as more than just infrastructure development project. It has also involved digital infrastructure such as hardware, software, network systems, and the Chinese have used mostly their domestic private sector giants and have built this kind of tech infrastructure in other countries. And and this is kind of similar to the state using technology to kind of utilize their own indigenous and domestic innovation to bring it on the global scale. They've done that in terms of consumer tech, especially in the Digital Silk Roads initiative. And also, one of the other ways is government to government technology. This is in terms of these critical and emerging technologies. We have always heard about this phrase of critical and emerging tech. So, what constitutes these technologies? There are a bunch of them. There's like semiconductors, AI, quantum, there is biotech, and autonomous vehicles, all these kind of stuff. So what the Chinese have also done is kind of strike pacts with other governments to kind of either export their own technology or finished goods and services in that field to the country, or they've also built this rapport with the foreign governments so that they can integrate them into their supply chain itself. And there are many supply chains. There are many technology supply chains which involve it cannot be done in just one single country, or it might need different stages of the supply chain might have different requirements which might have to come from different areas of the world. China has a very nicely kind of integrated that and told that, look, we will build a supply chain together, and we can work together, and each country can work together to build a technology supply chain for the usage of this critical and emerging tech itself. So if you consider those two broad areas, it's basically the consumer tech part and the government to government relations. It's on both sides, and China has done pretty well on both fronts. And I guess that would be like the broad classification.
So there's a lot to unpack there. So one of the first things that you mentioned was how technology or techplomacy can act as both an offensive and a defensive tool. So this is something which we are very interested in at Takshashila, right? We have an information warfare vertical for research. We believe that in the information age, information warfare is going to grow more, and it is going to be central to any country's security and defense. So, in this sort of a backdrop, could you sort of elaborate more on how techplomacy can be used as offensive and defensive tools? How is there a possibility to weaponize it? How is it going to be security issue for different nations which sort of have been brought into China's techplomacy efforts?
Yeah, sure. So one of the major things that China has successfully managed to do is focus on these key battlegrounds of digital competition, is what at least I call it. It's basically focused on cementing its efforts in developing countries wherein technology accessibility is still at a lesser stage. So what happens then is that the technology giants of China, such as Huawei, ZTE, kind of build these networks and these technology infrastructure in these digital battlegrounds. And digital battlegrounds, from what I mean, is the fact that there are certain regions in this world where technology has not developed to an extent where it has developed, let's say in the West, let's say in the US, Canada, or even Western Europe. So if you consider those regions, maybe something like Africa or Central Asia or Latin America, these regions are kind of the areas where you can kind of establish your own sphere of influence, in terms of the fact that if they are forced, or not even, you don't even have to coerce them into using your own technology. You can just strike deals and bargain with them, and say, look, you can use technology itself, we will build like information and communication technology infrastructure in your country, and through some kind of foreign policy projects and stuff like that. Now, one of the interesting things is the fact that there have been security concerns which are surrounding Huawei and Chinese tech, especially with the rise of 5G. And what they've done is that the fact that they have managed to mitigate this concern by offering low prices in terms of installation costs and running this whole system, and also have made these developing countries embrace Chinese technology due to lesser barriers. And one of the interesting things is the fact that there have been a lot of data centers which have been built by Chinese firms as part of the Digital Silk Roads initiative. And it's built in countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, and also many of these telecommunications equipment in countries like Sierra Leone, Senegal, and all are dominated by basically Chinese products itself. Now, if China kind of build this network of its own technology, there is a possibility that it can be used for surveillance in other countries or in other regions, and it can be used for wrongful purposes. I mean, we do not have any kind of indication that it has been used for that case, but it's also possible that when you completely own the technology infrastructure, you can kind of keep a lookout, or use that not just for giving accessibility to the local population, but also for your own strategic gains. Just to put it into context, like in the Cold War, America kind of had to put nuclear weapons in Turkey, and Russia retaliated by putting nuclear weapons in Cuba itself. So they said that, oh, look, we are closer to each other. I mean, like, Cuba is closer to America and Turkey is closer to Russia. So there's a possibility that we might have a chance to hurt them rather than using nuclear weapons from our own states. So in terms of that itself, if you own the tech infrastructure in these developing regions or anything like that, you can use that to create a worldwide grid and kind of use it for your own gains. I mean, purposes of these can be multiple purpose stuff, but we just have to know that it is possible for them to use this kind of tech infrastructure which they have built from the ground up for anything possible. And the other thing is the fact that they have managed to make a mark shaping tech governance frameworks itself. And this has been done through influencing the technical standard setting processes. I mean, I've talked about standards and the reason for technical standards being so important previously on the podcast itself. But the fact that China's assertiveness in the standards domain has been increasingly seen in the last few years. And the fact that Chinese technocrats are in leadership positions at key working groups and technical committees across international standard setting bodies kind of shows their deftness and lobbying power in the diplomacy field itself. Now, once you kind of push for the adoption of Chinese companies' global de facto standards in key areas, they can kind of get the majority of the patents and IP in the field, and it can create ripple effects in the technology landscape itself. Now, once they have managed to do that, you can kind of use that as entry barriers of technology for other firms. You can use that as preventing other firms from accessing technology. So Huawei owns most of the 5G related patents and standards. Now, if anyone, even American firms, want to kind of build on this 5G technology and kind of build a network around it, you have to pay royalty fees or get these licensing requirements from Huawei so that you can build it on that particular standard itself. So now you can easily block that from happening because you own the standard and you kind of have the IP rights, and you can use that to prevent any kind of competition, or even the fact that if you think this is a critical area which you have to dominate. Even America is doing that. America has been continuously putting export restrictions on semiconductor chips to China, considering the fact that US is the semiconductor powerhouse in the world. So they even ordered their own domestic private sector like Nvidia, AMD to stop exporting high computing chips, which is basically artificial intelligence chips, to China, which might hurt the economy and which might hurt the like profitability of these firms. But currently it's gone to a certain extent that these kind of tools have been used to hurt the other country rather than kind of keeping it as a global supply chain. So there are technology supply chains are fragmenting based off on who supports what or anything like that. So we might see kind of there are prospects that we might see a technological cold war in terms of the entire world getting divided into blocks which might either use American technology or which might use Chinese technology. And in that way, it's a very bad thing for like the technology landscape in general, because there needs a global consensus for the growth of tech itself. And this kind of coercive technology diplomacy which has been adopted by China, and I mean which has been reciprocated even by the West through export controls, import restrictions, and all that, has kind of put a dampener on the entire tech field itself.
Wow, thanks for that detailed summary of what China has been up to with its diplomacy efforts. I have a few more questions for you, Arjun, but before that, let's take a short break and we'll return with the discussion. Welcome back. So, we have been discussing China's diplomacy efforts with Arjun so far. And to some of the discussion over the last 20 minutes, we understand that China has been putting a lot of efforts into two or three things. Firstly, being promoting its consumer tech, which is led by its private sector. Firms like Huawei, ZTE, and a few others, they have established and rooted themselves in many countries across the world, and they are aggressively marketing themselves. The other is China is also cornering certain critical and emerging technological domains, such as semiconductors and others, so that it gains a stronger foothold as far as technology is concerned. And finally, China has also been playing a major role in setting the technological governance framework. I mean, it has a technological governance framework, and it has playing the role of setting worldwide tech standards, which we have discussed previously on this podcast as well. So I think we have a good picture of the apparent dangers of the Chinese strategy here. But let's look at this from China's own perspective, right? So, Arjun, I wanted to ask you, what is the perception in China? Have these efforts succeeded? Has diplomacy by China been a successful venture so far? Has it given China strategic returns that it has been looking for? Or do you think the pushback which is coming, for example, in 5G, we know there's a lot of pushback. Even India has steps to keep China out of the 5G market. So, do you think the pushback that China is receiving against its coercive diplomacy is going to play a spoiler here? So, what is your assessment like?
Yeah, so I think they have gotten gains also, but they've also encountered pushbacks. But the fact that uh, even in markets where they don't have a presence, especially in other supply chains wherein they do not have a major presence in the overall manufacturing of that technology or technology goods itself, they managed to implant themselves as at least a consumer of those goods. So in that way, China has kind of evolved from just being a major importer of technology to both an importer and exporter of technology. So once you're doing that, that means that you're kind of involved in these supply chains in some way or the other. So in terms of diplomacy efforts itself, they're focused on exporting tech. So you have a lot of their private sector giants kind of coming forward and building this kind of tech infrastructure in digital battlegrounds such as Africa and Central Asia, which are kind of evolved, like kind of maintained a global presence for these Chinese firms. And in terms of other ways, like in terms of imports itself, let's say semiconductors, right? So that in semiconductors, China is not such a major power. They are still way behind the US. They're still behind their neighbor Taiwan. But what they've done is the fact that they import so many semiconductors, components, and equipment, is the fact that they are a major consumer market for almost all other semiconductor powers. So it's hard to ignore them in that field also. You cannot exclude them from anything basically, because either they are a market for finished goods or they manufacture the goods themselves. So in either ways, they have been ingrained into this whole tech ecosystem, that no amount of sanctions which can be put can actually hurt them. And this has been seen through the sanctions which have been placed on China in by the US ever since 2020, like just before the pandemic, or just like during the pandemic, when the semiconductor supply chain broke down and there was a whole chip shortage also. There have been continuous sanctions which are being put on China from 2020 to 2022. But a recent report by Bloomberg showed that 19 out of the 20 fastest growing semiconductor firms are from China in the last 3 or 4 quarters. And the fact that they've continuously building on their own domestic capabilities, and they've done that either way. So yes, they have encountered pushbacks even in Huawei. All the major Five Eyes countries, which is basically the US, UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, if I'm not wrong. I don't know, I think it's Japan or New Zealand, one of them. So basically, all five of them have kind of banned Huawei equipment in their networks, and they've ordered that Huawei equipment has to be removed from their networks by the end of the decade. Some of them have already gone ahead and done that. So, yeah, it has hurt their private sector, especially the growth of these giants. But it's also the fact that they've kind of mitigated that through their own Techplomacy efforts, wherein they've reached out to other developing nations such as African countries, Central Asian countries, wherein they managed to implant themselves there instead. Yeah, in terms of economically, they do suffer quite a bit due to the pushback by the West. The sanctions, the export controls, the restrictions of technology goods and services across borders. But what they've done is that they've used their heft in the field to kind of build these diplomatic relationships with other countries, developing countries, which are in the need for technology accessibility. So they can give that to them at a lower cost, at a better rate. Or even the fact that these kind of security concerns won't matter to developing countries as much as developed countries, as long as they have access to emerging technology itself. So in that way, they've mitigated whatever pushback they've got through increased diplomatic efforts itself. I think they'll continue to do that. The fact that they've managed to kind of increase the sphere of influence across the continent, especially across the Indo-Pacific, and going all the way to Africa, now in Latin America also. So there is no end to kind of using technology to make a mark in different countries around the world. And I guess as we move forward, the more that the West, if like not just the US, even European countries try to keep China out of technology supply chains and the other technology ecosystem itself, there there would be that increasing divide which would be seen. And China would continue to look at other regions for mitigating their economic loss, or like financial losses which they suffer due to these sanctions placed by the West.
You know what? I have a lot more questions about China for you, but we could go on and on, but time constraints sort of stop me. So let's actually, I have a final question for you, right? So let's take a step back from China. Let's understand that diplomacy is here to stay, right? And the information age, diplomacy is a vital tool in the arsenal of any state which is conducting foreign policy. So definitely, I believe India should be engaging in it. and I believe it already is. However, I wanted to pose this question to you. India is an IT giant. We have a thriving IT sector. We are sitting in Bangalore, which is the IT capital of the country. But other than that, India is also making slow progress in many other technological domains, right? And India is also exploring relationships with Southeast Asian countries and African countries so that it can bolster its diplomatic efforts. So, in this context, again looking at China, but a broader question. So, what do you think are the lessons or takeaways that India has from the recent efforts of diplomacy being conducted by China and other world powers?
Yeah, in terms of, just looking at China and other world powers, I guess one of the most important aspects is the fact that they've utilized their domestic private sector. We know that the Chinese state has provided support. It may not be just financial support, but just, like support in general to create a thriving business environment for building its tech sector, even though it might come under the umbrella of the state, and there might be still certain restrictions. But technology giants have kind of propped up, and they have been supported by the state itself to compete on the global stage with competitor firms. So once that foundation is laid, the state has utilized its domestic tech giants in its diplomatic efforts to achieve their foreign policy objectives. And we've seen that because, firms like Huawei, SETI, and all have made a mark in improving the Chinese state's own technological footprint beyond its borders. So one of the key areas for India to do that is to kind of utilize our own domestic tech sector. There have been kind of reports about how we need to be self-sufficient, and this whole concept of Atmanirbharta, and the fact that we need not look at other countries for our growth, which is fine, which totally makes sense. But also, you need to understand that for the private sector to grow in the country, you need to kind of have access to the global value chain itself. Any kind of efforts to completely exclude India from the value chain itself will hurt the nation's prospects rather than kind of improve it. We have not been part of any trade deal, like major multilateral trade deal. We pulled out of RCEP. We're not part of the TPP. And the fact that we're not even part of the extended ITA, which is the Information Technology Agreement Act of 2015. It is basically trade deal which is meant for only technology goods and services, and it engages in technology trade, and it provides kind of facilitates cross-border movements of these technology goods and services. And India is not a signatory of that yet. So this kind of hurts the private sector's access to the global tech itself, and it cannot help them become global or an international giant. They will for always be restricted to India, and that would hurt us in carrying out our diplomatic efforts using technology itself. So once use your domestic private sector to build on their own successes and make them kind of an important part and parcel of your tech diplomacy efforts, then you cannot have anything to kind of push your diplomatic efforts on. Even during COVID, right? Unless that we had certain biotech firms which would manufacture COVID-19 vaccines at such a major volume, like they could keep manufacturing it on such a short notice, but keep pushing out these vaccines in a very short interval of time, then we would not have kind of any vaccine diplomacy to carry out. We could not export these vaccines to other countries, our neighboring countries, unless the private sector chipped in and actually ensured that would happen. So one is that. And also, the whole concept of technology infrastructure has to come into the picture. Now, infrastructure just does not mean roads, railways, ports, etc. Now, infrastructure also means, and keeping technology in mind, it should mean telecommunication networks, renewable energy grids, and all of those have to come into the picture when you are contributing to infrastructure projects in countries abroad. Yes, it's always good to have a port and other military bases to protect your strategic interests, but also the fact that your foreign policy should also kind of include these kind of tech infrastructure projects also that would help India a lot in terms of exporting its own technology. So India is one of the founding members of the International Solar Alliance along with France. Just an example, they can use the ISA to kind of push for building solar farms and solar energy grids other ISA countries. Once they do that, it would be Indian technology which is on foreign soil. That is just an example of how you can use technology to increase your diplomatic heft. And once you have that kind of technology infrastructure, you kind of are increasing your own sphere of influence, and also you're strengthening the global value chain of that particular technology, and also contributing towards overall development of that field itself. So especially China's BRI initiative has kind of shown that. So we can use that to build this kind of infrastructure, form a techno-democratic alliance with a technology infrastructure development plan for other developing countries coming together with other powers. So you can bring together the Quad or even BRICS or whatever. Those guys can come together, form a plan for building technology infrastructure across developing countries, and use that to kind of increase your own sphere of influence. I mean, sphere of influence always is viewed with a negative lens, but in this case, it's more or less kind of using technology to empower the other country's citizens, as well as to showcase to the world that our technology can be adopted on a global and international scale. Once we can do that, then I think we're on the right track, and we are pretty far away from doing that. So I hope we can do that soon.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So we do hope like something like a techno-democratic alliance takes place, and India can utilize its tech power to emerge as a counterweight to China and other global powers. But that is it from today's discussion. Thank you, Arjun, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shri. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and to all our listeners, stay tuned to All Things Policy. Thank you.